I'm Aaron Blohowiak. I am at Aaron Blohowiak on Twitter. There is actually another Aaron Blohowiak on Twitter. I do not tweet about sports stuff. So if you're looking, it's mostly hot takes on distributed systems things. Or aaronb@netflix.com. I share my email so you all will use it, hopefully, if you have anything you want to discuss later. So let's get started. On your first day at Netflix, you can push code into prod. You can spend up to $25 million without manager approval. You can sign contracts, and all we ask is that you use good judgment. On your first day, are you ready to do any of that? No. So how do we get from here to there? How do we get from your first day where you don't really know what's going on to the point where you can flex the freedom that we grant you up front? We do that through our culture. We avoid rules. Rules are something that most organizations tend to accrete over time. As they have bad things happen, they put in a rule to never let that happen again. And as a result, they end up artificially limiting the space of options for people. People feel constrained. They feel like they're in a tight jacket. They can't have the freedom to do what they know is the right thing. Instead, we say, you know what? We don't need rules. What we need is smart people who know what's going on in the world, who have the right context, that they can use really good judgment. And to that end, we generally prefer people over process. The world is ever changing. Your process is always a lagging indicator. It reflects the way that the world was 5 years ago when the process was put in place, not in the way that the world will be in 5 years. To that end, we try to have context, not control. Again, you can't make really good decisions if you don't understand the larger world, if you don't understand how your decisions here impact somebody else. We have this thing we talk about a lot called freedom and responsibility. Part of the key needs for having good context is to avoid the case where my freedom becomes your responsibility. Gathering context, understanding the world, super important. If you try to have control as a leader, be that a manager, senior software engineer, team lead, director, you will not have nearly as much information as the people on the ground actually doing the work. So a much better trade-off to do is to give the right information to people who can actually be there to make the decisions day to day. Finally, I mentioned briefly freedom and responsibility. This isn't just a slogan or a tagline. This runs deep. It's how we structure everything. Freedom means we default to opening up and retaining optionality, having more potential things that you could do be things that you would consider doing. And responsibility means if you're going to have all of this freedom, well, then we're going to hold you to account for the results of your actions, for the quality of your decision making. And it is important to separate out the quality of decision making from the result. We all are operating in an uncertain world, but that responsibility over time is really what we're looking for. So from the CEO down the hierarchy, that responsibility is delegated. Our chairman and CEO is ultimately responsible for everything that every Netflix employee does. And that responsibility stems from the shareholders who effectively own the company. That responsibility gets divvied up and then delegated down the hierarchy from the C-suite to the VPs, to the directors, to the managers, to the senior software engineers, team leads, and senior ICs on teams. And that's really how you can scale yourself. If our CEO tried to make all of the decisions, well, that certainly wouldn't work. I spent a better part of a decade working at startups before working at Netflix, and I can tell you I've seen CEOs who try to have all the decision-making fall in their head, and none of those startups are currently in business. Similarly, that vision is refined. So as an ongoing enterprise, we have a pretty simple business to describe. We offer a service for sale, people give us money, and we provide the service. From that large vision of streaming movies and videos online, there's lots of details to figure out. The potential space of things that we could do as a business is vast. Now, the job that the leadership hierarchy has, the primary job, is to narrow the scope of options of the problems that we're solving and to narrow the scope of the solutions that we're willing to consider. And this happens at each layer. Again, as you get closer and closer to the work itself, the vision should be more refined. But along the way, we still want to retain maximal flexibility so that the people who are closest to the work can make the best decisions that they have. We really pride ourselves on how few decisions management is involved in. I've heard a rumor from a secondary or tertiary source that our CEO has bragged about having only made a couple decisions in the last year. And that all goes down to setting the right context and having the right people. So this expectation that we have for every employee at Netflix, responsibility and follow through. If you say you're going to do something, I am not going to check up on you. Ever. We hire fully formed adults. We expect that when you say it, it's going to happen. And if it's not going to happen, you're going to proactively reach out and manage that graceful disappointment, which is necessary. You shouldn't be afraid to disappoint people. You should just do it very well. We also want you to not just be responsible, but proactive. So you need to be thinking 2 steps ahead. Netflix employees aren't only the ones who will stop by to pick up the trash, they might also consider moving the trash can closer to where it needs to be. That proactivity anticipation is really what lets you as a leader scale yourself, having more heads truly brought to bear to the problem. Finally, in addition to just thinking ahead in the short term, we want all of your decisions to be based in the long term. We hope to be a very long-lasting business, a very long-going concern, and so we want to set ourselves up for future success. Now, this doesn't mean giving into Yagni-type issues, as if you were in Justin's talk previously, he mentioned we plan for 2 to 4x scale. Some places plan for 10x scale. We do want to plan in the future. We will be revising our decisions, but overall, we do want to take that long-term view. And finally, we expect every employee to be defining how things should be. I worked at one place a long time ago where there was an employee who was responsible for creating a report together. And we were sitting in the cafeteria, and she was complaining to me, you know, I spent about 1/3 of my time putting this report together, and I know that the directors I give it to barely look at it. Well, why are you doing the report? And she didn't feel empowered to say, hey, is this really the best use of my time? Would a 2-page summary be good enough? When we have that freedom and responsibility, it creates that sense of, yes, I should be helping shape how things should work, not just responsible for executing against my particular role. And we expect everyone to have that kind of owner mentality, that kind of architect mentality. So this expectation really translates that every employee at Netflix will have the highest level of ownership. Now, this is pretty Netflixy. We tend to hire very senior people, and we do give them that incredible amount of freedom. So we do require that very high level of ownership, that vision level of ownership, of understanding how things should be. Not every org expects that of every employee, and that's totally fine. But through this talk, I hope to give you a framework for understanding the different levels of ownership that will help you navigate understanding what the right level of ownership is for the right person at the right time. So, what is ownership? It's really a collection of beliefs, of attitudes, and behaviors. Do people believe that they own the destiny of their particular responsibility? Do they have this mindset that they can have the freedom to do what's right? And finally, are they proactive in understanding what needs to happen next? And not only immediately, but in the long run. So what's important is that ownership is not this yes or no thing. It's not a single bit that can flip. Although Shannon did talk about fractional bits, that's really confusing. No, it's not binary, it's the spectrum. So what are the different levels of ownership as we've defined them? The 0th level of ownership, I'm not a Lua programmer, so is demonstration, which is ultimately no ownership. I'm going to do something, or the senior person or the lead in this scenario is going to do the thing, and the person who is having the responsibility ultimately delegated to them will be responsible for asking really great questions. Okay, so that's demonstration. The next level is oversight. You're going to do it, but I'm going to want to have myself or somebody else pre-approve it. Look at it first, and you should expect a lot of revisions. The next level is observation. Go ahead, you do it, and I'll look at it after it's already done, and maybe give you some high-level guidance. So at these 3 levels, there's this fundamental aspect of approval that's occurring from the person that's delegating the responsibility. And we try to spend as little time as possible in these levels at Netflix, as we want people to ramp up quickly. Now, on your first day, you probably will be at demonstration just learning how are things done here. While we don't have rules, we do have norms, and that helps things go smoothly. Moving beyond that approval realm of ownership, we start to get into independent execution. We can establish this is the place we want to go to, and I know that you're going to do a great job. There will be some random check-ins just so I can keep abreast of what's happening and understand how you're doing your job. But ultimately, you're kind of heads down or out in the world, and we'll check in our one-on-ones. And finally is that last level, that vision level, where you're shaping the future and you're understanding your area of responsibility and all of the stakeholder domains, how your area of responsibility interacts with them, and the larger business context. That's that vision level of ownership that we expect every individual contributor at Netflix to embody. Again, if your organization puts that expectation at a different level, that's fine. This is just a framework for talking about it. So that demonstration level, the belief here is that you are in a student role. You do not yet know what is going on. And it's important to know when you don't know what's going on. And so your behaviors here should really be asking great questions, not just the what's, but the whys. Why is it done that way? How did you come to this standard? What's the purpose of using master as our integration branch? All of these sorts of things. You want to learn as fast as possible. With our ramp-up framework that we have on our team, we have it so you have an onboarding buddy that's basically is there to answer all of your questions. And the quicker that you can extract information from their brain, the better you're doing as you onboard. That next level is oversight. Again, we try to spend very little time in here. The one thing that we do have an ongoing expectation for oversight is things like changes to the code. So pull requests are fantastic for sharing knowledge throughout the team, and in some ways that is an expression of ownership. Now your role of being overseer or overseen will change depending on whether or not you authored the PR or you're reviewing, which also goes to show that these dynamics around ownership are changing over time within relationships and within particular projects. The attitude here, if you're experiencing the oversight, is to be grateful for the additional context that's being provided to you. And if you're providing the oversight, the attitude needs to be one of empathy and understanding that, hey, if I'm going to put 50 comments on your pull request, that's kind of tough, you know? So you got to figure out how to message that in an empathetic way. That observation level. Here, we're really in that reactive mode now, where you're operating mostly independently, but someone who's responsible for delegating to you is going to observe and give you high-level realignment, long-term adjustments, course corrections, rather than really detailed feedback at all times. And many places, this is what they start to consider like a mid-level engineer to be, low impact on the immediate manager or leader of whatever form that may take. Now that can be really tempting to get stuck in that level as a leader because you still know what's going on and you can feel like people are able to pursue mastery, autonomy, and purpose. But the fact that you're ever present and watching all of the work that they're doing takes a whole bunch of your time and ultimately deprives them of understanding what it means to be truly independent. So moving on to execution, this is where the leader sets the direction and then checks in infrequently to see how things are going. And this is where a lot of people top out when they start to describe what it means to be a senior engineer in a lot of teams. Very little management oversight, and at this point of execution, you should be able to train somebody else to do the same tasks. Fundamentally, though, that vision level is the highest level we want to get to, where you're looking further out. I think I might have belabored that point, so I will just proceed. So we have here the hierarchy of the levels of ownerships, and there is an analogy to something that you might be familiar with, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So starting about midway through at the observation level, you have that community interaction where someone is looking at the work that you're doing. You have an understanding that you belong. You have that approval that can feel good. Ultimately, you want to go further than that and get into this notion of esteem that Maslow had, where you get the confidence and respect of the people around you. That's very similar to execution. If someone says, go there, and I know you can go there without worrying about it or checking in, that means that you really have my confidence. Maslow initially talked that the peak of the hierarchy of needs is self-actualization, determining who I am going to be and how I fit in to the world and what I want to be for myself, rather than taking in other people's role expectations. That's very similar to this vision level of ownership where you are imagining for yourself the way that things should be. Now, fun historical fact, the pyramid representation was never presented during Maslow's lifetime. And in his writing, he talked about these different levels never needing to get rid of the first level, right? So you always need to eat. You always need to have your basic needs met. It's just that as you develop personally, you spend an additional portion of your time working on the higher levels of personal development. This is very similar in ownership. Even when you're very tenured at the company, there will be some things that you still want to have somebody else pre-approve before you send out. It may be that you're reaching out to peers to take a second look at something. When we publish things to the tech blog, of course, there are people that that have expertise that we're going to rely on. So we never totally abandon the lower levels of ownership throughout our careers, no matter how advanced we are. So does this sound good? All right. Hopefully you want to build a team of high ownership individuals. And that's where hopefully we want to get to. So this talk is how to do that, how to cultivate ownership. But really, it's talk about how not to cultivate ownership. And I will be leading here by counterexample. So all of many of the names in what follows, these stories, have been changed to protect the innocent. And they really are the innocent. As my brother likes to say, the response you get is the message you sent. So as a leader, if I'm not seeing the correct level of ownership from the people on my team, it's my failure to set the correct context. I didn't give them the right information they needed to make the best decisions possible. So for the first story, we're going to talk about Archie's communications. Archie was very experienced when he joined Netflix, like many people who are when they join. Unlike many people who join Netflix, he expected that the way that Netflix did things was going to be very similar to the way that he had done things previously. Now, one of the things that our team does is we perform regional evacuations. So, quick 2-minute spiel. We run in 3 different AWS regions. We can run in any 2 of the 3 for high availability reasons. And so we regularly evacuate regions. As a result of doing that, we then send a communication out to tell people, hey, how'd this go? So when Archie was onboarding, I said, hey, go ahead, here's the folder on Google Drive, look at our best communications, use the template, please match the tone, formatting, and style, and run it by me before you send it out. Archie, being very experienced before joining, wanted to show his proactive spirit, and he went ahead and put an email together and sent it out without asking for anyone to look it over first. Now that email had spelling, grammatical, and factual errors. And unbeknownst to him, when he copied the email address from the template, that distribution list included all of engineering. So I had tried to set us at that oversight level, and he wanted to jump straight to that execution level. We had that chat, and I told him, there was a reason why I asked to be at oversight level here. And I realized that I had failed to provide that context, so he didn't have all the information he needed. If it was just an email going out to our team, maybe up our management chain, might not have been a big deal. So, to visualize this, I thought that we were somewhere between demonstration and oversight. Archie thought that we were at execution. That mismatch is where the pain crept in. So the mistake here is that we had different ideas about which levels we should be at. And the discovery is that you really need to be explicit about what level we are at and what level we should be at, and then explain why we're at the level we're at. So now we'll talk about Lily. Lily is amazing. She joined after Archie, and same spiel. Here's the folder. Please match the tone, format, and style. Let me look it over before you send it out. Lily's great. Her email was perfect, no errors at all. And she said, does this look good? I said, looks good to me. Awesome. Now the problem was the next time she sent the email, she also asked me to look it over. And I was like, I wanted to encourage her to start taking that additional ownership. So I started replying with just Slack emojis. And I thought this was going to encourage her to go ahead and like, hey, okay, you got this. But instead of encouraging her, it actually reaffirmed I was giving my rubber stamp. And by giving that stamp, I was underscoring that we were at the oversight level. So we had a little chat, and I said, hey, I do not need or want to look over your work. You're great. Go for it. She said, cool. And never again has she asked me to look over her emails. So I thought that we'd moved on to observation. I'm still on that engineering email list. But she thought that we were at oversight, because that's what I had told her. So the mistake here is that we had different levels, or different ideas about which level we're at. And the discovery was that we want to be really explicit when that level changes. So Lily has a very ingrained sense of propriety, and since I had made an explicit request to look over this email, she was going to go ahead and follow through with that from now until the end of her employment. What I should have really done was the next thing was that if someone's stuck in that approval-seeking behavior, they might just be waiting for permission. She didn't love getting my approval. She didn't need it or really care about it. She was just trying to follow what I had set up for her as the context. That final thing is that if I'd established the goal that everyone should ultimately get to vision with each of the tasks that they're at, then she would have had upfront permission to escalate that level of ownership on her own, at her terms, when she was ready. So Lily then took over a relatively recent activity that our team does, which is we load test entire regions. So with our traffic steering mechanism, we can send everyone to the same region and see how the system does as traffic scales up. What was interesting about this was it was taking over for a relatively new thing that somebody else had created. So when Lily was taking this over, the first time she ran it, she appropriately was going around asking lots of questions. She created memos with all of her plans and ran them by her peers, who said, "Yep, looks good to me." That first squeeze, total success. Afterwards, I said, "All right, Lily, you did this. We were at that oversight observation level. Now this is totally yours. Run, go nuts with it. I expect you to be at the vision level." And since then, for the next squeeze, she created stakeholder listening groups where she solicited for people's input. She created a rubric by which we will evaluate all of the different feature requests and set up a roadmap for the entire project for the next year. All without me saying anything other than, "This is yours now." Right? So much success. So here, I thought that we were at vision, and she thought that we were at vision. Sometimes you get it right. And so again, that's just really the importance of being explicit when that level changes. Getting a bit more serious, we have Fred's performance tooling. Fred is amazing. Fred was a little bit less experienced when joining our team, but ramped up incredibly quickly. He got onto our on-call faster than anyone had before. He really had that depth of curiosity and drive that really inspired us and made me confident that I had made a great hire. So there is this new greenfield project to detect performance regressions in systems in prod by looking at the CPU to RPS ratio. The details don't matter, but they're interesting. And so due to the track record of success that he had, the incredible trajectory, I was like, all right, you got this. Let's just go ahead. And we had agreed that we'd operate at that execution level. He'd independently knew that he had to develop this performance regression tooling, and he knew what the overall timeline was for the larger project at play here. So that seemed fine. Well, after a couple check-ins, there were some yellow flags around some decisions he made and some judgment calls about how he was prioritizing his work. Now, as someone who prides himself on not being a micromanager, I waited to see if this was a pattern, if this was a one-off thing, because I don't want to nitpick someone's every decision. I just want to understand the long-term trends to their judgment making. After about a month, I started to get worried that there were no big milestones. And I decided it was time to dig a bit deeper. What I had learned at that time was not only was he not close to having a prototype ready, but he was still in the deep weeds of investigating different algorithms for comparing the data of previous to current performance work. That was wildly out of step with our expectations that you're going to get something done from end to end with kind of a not so good algorithm that can detect huge performance variations, and then we can refine things over time. That was the sort of implicit value that our team had around getting something done end to end and then refining it, as opposed to understanding truly the best algorithm and then building the UI to support that algorithm. Now, there are a few different ways we could look at this. We very well could say, bad performance. We expect something to be done. It's not done. That's on you. We could also look at it as poor judgment. Okay, so what you were doing through this algorithmic evaluation was very good work, but the judgment of this being the thing you need to do versus getting something working end to end, that's poor judgment. You should know as a mature member of our staff that get something done, make it work, then make it right. We could take that approach when evaluating what happens. We could also look at it as bad onboarding. Maybe that onboarding buddy of his was responsible for setting the context. This is how we do things, greenfield project, here you go. So many places that we could point the finger of blame. My dad has this thing where he says when you point your finger, there are 3 that point right back at you. So we could also look at this as that incorrect level of ownership. And this is the one I'm going to say I believe. I don't believe in blaming the victim. So I thought that we should be at execution. He thought that we should be at execution, but we should have been at observation. If there was a bit closer monitoring of what was going on, I could have intervened much earlier on, and we wouldn't have to claw back. He wouldn't feel like he was a failure for the past month working on the wrong thing, and he would have quickly escalated up to execution once we knew that he was headed in the right direction. So this mistake was that we agreed at what level we were at, but we were both wrong. And finally, the discovery was that even amazing people can't just jump into that deep end. They don't understand the current context, that implicit values. And not only do they not understand the current context, but their onboarding buddy or the leadership present doesn't even know what they've forgotten to tell them, right? The curse of knowledge. I don't know how much I know about Netflix because I've been in it so long. It's like the fish in water kind of thing. So now we'll talk about Akwaysy after I take a sip of water. Akwaysy is amazing. Senior contributor to Netflix, been with us for a little while, had been executing fully independently, had been operating at the vision level, helping us understand what our team is and what it should be. He proposed a giant project that would affect how hundreds of teams operate in production. He created the documents. He led it through our decision-making process. Awesome, beautiful work. The giant project, through that process, it got approved. Awesome, everything was going great. As part of the first steps of the project's execution, Akwaysy was going to meet with a bunch of the different teams to understand more deeply our stakeholders' concerns, brainstorm some UI decisions, those kinds of things. And I was super excited, and I was like, you know what, Akwaysy, can you add me as optional to those meetings? This is what he said. So for those of you that may not be well-versed in management theory, there's no better signal that you're a crap manager than having someone ask you this question. You know, I wish I could say that I understood the ramifications of my actions. I really wish I could say I was my best Aaron that day. And I wasn't. I was so excited for what was going on, I wanted to be part of the party. And from Akwasy's perspective, he was executing at the vision level, kicking butt. And here I was saying, hey, yeah, so I want to be in the room while you do this, and I'm going to watch you as you work. How could he not take that step down from vision to observation, or in his mind, oversight, as anything but a signal that I didn't trust him, as taking away something from him, as ratcheting down my expectations? Now on my side, Akwaysy had been kicking butt, performing at a very high level, not only influencing our team, but beyond our team in all of production engineering. I wanted to see what he was doing so I could be justified and well-versed when I was making the case that he gets compensated at a whole new level. And this is the question he asked me. It was tough. It was super tough. I tried to explain to him, hey, this is why. But if you've ever tried to put toothpaste back in the bottle, you know, emotions are hard. This was a tough lesson to learn. So I thought, from my reasons as a manager, as a leader, that we needed to go to that observation level. Again, so I could justify the compensation increase commensurate with the new role that I had every expectation he was going to fulfill. From his level, he thought he should be at vision, because that's where he had been executing at. That's where he'd been kicking butt at. Those mismatches, that's where the pain comes in. So there's mistakes here were that we had different ideas about which level we should be at. And the discovery was that ownership really evolves over time. Not just over the course of relationships, like it would have with the other people I had talked about, but even the course of projects itself. And not only in the upwards direction, but up and down as things come and go. For reasons sometimes related to the project, for reasons sometimes related to being a manager, for reasons sometimes related to my boss's boss somehow is trying to micromanage this and I need to provide you cover. If you don't make that clear to people, they don't have the right context. All they see is you're ratcheting up the desire for approval. So you really have to have empathy for those emotional implications of changes to the levels of ownership. So starting to bring it all together now. We had these 4 levels of ownership. Watch me. I want to pre-approve. I'll watch you. Go ahead and do it. Tell me what we need to do. And again, this is not a strict hierarchy, but we have all of these different things happening at different levels over time. If I had made this more clear, perhaps with Akwaysy, the fact that we had a little bit of green sneaking in would have been okay. So there's some broad classes of mistakes that we can categorize, mostly around those level mismatches. We can have different ideas about which level we are at. We can have different ideas about which level we should be at. And we can agree on the level that we're at, but we can both be wrong. Those big discoveries are all about understanding that most failures of ownership are failures to set that right context. Given the right information, people will make the right decisions. Along with those lines, sometimes a piece of that context is what your expected level is, and that the goal is going to be to get to vision, and that the level will change over time. Don't jump in the deep end, even for amazing people on your team. Sometimes we've heard that phrase, they weren't set up for success. Well, that can mean we didn't provide them adequate scaffolding to get from where they needed to go from a zone of incompetence into a zone of mastery. Helping provide that ladder, that escalation of ownership, sets people up for success over time. And finally, as leaders, we all have to have empathy. I found it to be particularly hard to have empathy 2 times. When I'm really excited, and I just think, oh, everyone's going to think this is great. And I forget that the way that they're going to take this might not be the way I intend it. And the second time is if I ever find myself feeling righteous. But that's a different talk for another day. So again, just to drive this point home, given the right context and that freedom to do what you think's right, people will make great decisions. One of the things that our team is responsible for is managing all of the reservations and capacity for all of Netflix on Amazon, which is quite a big responsibility. And the way that we do this is we let every engineer do what they think's best in spinning up instances, in auto-scaling, and choosing instance migrations. And instead of trying to prevent errors in those spaces, we pursue rapid recovery. If something goes a little hinky, if we see a dramatic increase to your scale with a low utilization, we'll come have a chat and say, hey, what's up? And when we talk to some of our peers and they ask, so how do you achieve sublinear cloud costs to your business growth without having cost controls? We say, well, people want to do the right thing, and so we let them. And sometimes they don't even know when they may have let something go on too long or run too cold. And so giving them that context, they will prioritize it. If they got a big push, maybe they'll delay, and that's good for the business. Maybe they'll say, oh, whoops, I'll actually turn on a TTL for my logs that are stored in S3 and save a bunch of money every month. Again, having that right context lets people make great decisions. And if you instead lean on control, people think, oh, not my job. They won't even be that proactive. So actually, having that freedom creates in people that sense of responsibility. So if you take nothing else from this talk, this should be the main takeaway. So as a way to embody this on that team, to have a culture of ownership, not just a one-off in each of the different relationships, we bring this in to the very beginning of that relationship of the person on the team. The first thing that I do in our first one-on-one is I say, thank you, how's it going? And the second thing I do is I talk about the levels of ownership. And I say that after the first 3 months, we have certain expectations for you. You will primarily be in that demonstration, oversight, and observation mode. We expect you at the end of the 3 months to have asked a heck of a lot of questions, to learn the reasons why we do the things we do, and to be part of our on-call rotation. That's the goal for 3 months. In 6 months, we expect you to be handling one of our quarterly goals that the team outside of yourself has previously established as the right thing to do, but executing on that independently. So we expect you to be at that execution level before the end of your 6 months on the team. And finally, after the end of the first year, you need to be responsible for helping us set what the team should be, helping shape the vision of the team. Now, again, that vision level is our expectation of every IC at Netflix in almost every role that I'm aware of. And that may be unique to us, but still setting a timeline for your expectations of what kind of ownership you expect to see in general sets people up for success. So a quick flashback. Remember Archie, the one who sent the email to all of engineering? So that was totally on me. I hadn't set the context that this distribution list included all of engineering. And maybe if I had, maybe Archie would have slowed down. But those factual errors that were in there were actually a sign of things to come. Archie was so experienced in his career and so used to operating at a very high level that he just wanted to get back to doing that kind of work. But that's not quite the way that things work for us. We expect you to come in and work your way from the brilliant basics all the way on up to ratchet up the level of ownership over time. And he kept on trying to jump forward and would rush through the work that he viewed as more pedestrian. So his work product, while there was a lot of it, none of it was really usable. So we had to ratchet down that level of ownership and really set it clear, look, we want to have oversight over all of the work that you're doing. Either he didn't hear it, he didn't want it, but the work that he produced was not commensurate with the work he had produced in the interview process. And ultimately, he failed to ratchet up those levels of ownership. And I had to make the call to fire him. Now, firing someone is never an easy thing to do. But if you have a value, that value is most going to be expressed in your hiring, promotion, and firing decisions. So while it wasn't great to look someone in the eye and say, today is your last day, I knew what I had to do. I knew what the right thing was for us and for the team. So even though we try and set all failures of ownership are failures of context, if someone has repeated, explicit feedback over a length of time and they still fail to get to the level that's expected, and it might not be the last level depending on your organization or team, but if they fail to make that transition successfully, or if they go, they operate fine, and then they sink back down, and you see this happen a couple times, well, then you know what you need to do. They're not in the right role. So a quick bonus track. I think we have some time. So back to our good friend Maslow. So this is what most people are familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. But later in his career, he came to revisit this, and he said, self-actualization, this idea that the highest expression of oneself is figuring out what I want to be, well, that's a bit egoic, isn't it? And what he came to understand was that there was a higher level, and that hold on, I want to read this, because I want to get it right. You find your fullest realization by giving oneself to something beyond oneself. And so when you live not just for yourself to understand what I should be, but when you live to understand what my community should be, what the larger world should be, the larger environment, that's really the pinnacle of self-development. And there's a corollary here in our levels of ownership. And I would say that that's cultivating other people's ownership. Now, astute viewers would notice I have a little wiggle room in this slide. I'll point it out to you. So we do expect all of the ICs at Netflix to achieve the vision level of ownership. That new meta level of cultivation, that's an expectation that we have for everybody who's in a leadership position. And that could be senior engineers on the team, could be senior technical contributors, it could be effective team leads. It's also managers, directors, all of our VPs on up. We expect that you are cultivating other people's sense of ownership. And then at the higher level, our expectation for directors is that they are making sure that the managers that report to them are doing the cultivation of the people, and transitively and recursively and wheels within wheels, all the way on up. So, thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed the talk. Thank you. Thank you.
Hi. Great talk. So a little bit further on this cultivation, like how do we recognize when people are ready for the next level of ownership and that we're not preventing them from achieving that by providing too much training wheels?
Sure. So the question was basically around how do we help ratchet people up through the different levels and know when they're ready? And there, I think that I take a lot of inspiration from a guy whose name is Vygotsky, who talked about the zone of proximal development. So there are some things at which you have total mastery over and some things at which you have total incompetency about. And within that, you have this levels that you can do things when you have different levels of assistance. And so you can start by providing a lot of assistance and you slowly take away that assistance. So for instance, if someone's you think that they're operating successfully at the observation level and they might be ready for independent execution level, well, there's not really a change in kind, but more a change in degree with the frequency of check-ins, the frequency of feedback that you're giving them, and you slowly can back away. Similarly, from execution to vision, start to ask those questions of, so this is how things are, should it be this way? And then once you get to encourage those kinds of conversations, you're starting to really enjoy what you're hearing from them, then you should start setting the context of, I shouldn't be asking you, should it be this way? You should be telling me what the alternatives are, what you're considering, how those things are going on. And so there are like progressive steps between the different levels.
Hi, my question is based on, you mentioned the Netflix being one of the mature company, you have experienced resources being hired. Now, and you prefer the people over the processes. Now, for few of the companies that may not true stand because you need to have people without experience or less experience. So if you find they are not the right fit, you got to have some process in place to scale them up and put them in the right place. So without process, how you can achieve that? If you just give them freedom, or if you just, how do you make them successful?
That's a fantastic question. To summarize it, if you aren't Netflix, if you don't just hire senior individuals, how can you actually have people over process if you have junior folks who are going to unknowingly do really bad things? Is that about right? So there I would say that you actually don't need to lean into process. What you need to lean into is people having a high degree of self-awareness. You need to understand in every relationship that you're in, you are either in the role of teacher or student. Very rarely are you true peers. Understanding what role that you're in which context, that takes a fair degree of self-awareness. And many people who are fresh out of school, me certainly included at that time, have an overinflated sense of self. And the key context you can set there is like, you're not that good. I believe in you. You're going to get there. And here's how you're going to do it. And then you can provide that level of understanding. In the beginning, you're going to be learning. You're going to have lots of oversight, lots of feedback. And the way that you will work in terms of progressing through the levels, that's determined by you. But right now, for you to be successful at your level, you need to be great at being demonstrated to. I'm going to judge you on the quality of your questions. For oversight, you're going to be judged based on how well you loop people in to ask them to oversee your work. And once you demonstrate true competency at this level, then you'll be ready for the next. And so ultimately, I suspect, but have not practiced, using people over process, even with more junior folks, if you set that appropriate context of expectation of what level they're at.
So this was great, and I absolutely adore it. A lot of the examples were within team. I'm curious about what level of success you've had in managing this across teams when you have individuals thinking they're executing on vision versus execution.
Sure, so managing within team versus outside of the team and cross teams with having individuals who think that they're operating at vision versus execution. I think that can be really challenging. One of the things in John Maxwell's 5 stages of leadership that he talks about is that you reset in each relationship. So each time that you're interacting with somebody new, you go back to almost zero trust, and you have to build that up over time. Now, in large organizations, we have proxy signals for how trustworthy someone is, reporting structure, title sometimes, that kind of thing. But ultimately, it is a relationship-based business. And so having that be part of the conversations is something that we found being very important to achieve big project success. Now, to get a bit more concrete, one of the things that we have made a first-level citizen in our decision-making process is who the stakeholders are. And so by calling that out and saying these are the different levels of involvement, you're helping write the proposal, you're helping approve the proposal or signal your approval of the proposal, because we don't achieve consensus, we don't seek that. Or if you're kind of like watching and monitoring from the outside which level you're at, that will help us understand how to relate to you. And so it is that sort of like opt-in people over process, but with a bit of a cultural norm that everyone should feel comfortable saying, oh, hey, I need to be much more involved in this than I currently am. And that's a totally fine thing to do, which also means it has to be okay with saying, oops, I totally forgot you. And that also has to be fine. And then through those relationships, we can ultimately navigate those interactions. Now, it does get sticky, especially if you have someone who has, say, a security concern and someone who has a product deadline, and they can be in tension, and then who's really the one to set that vision? Well, that would be a great talk I would attend. Did that answer your question? Cool. I
have a question. You talked a couple of times, you mentioned that you try to, in your organization, teach new people, this is why we do what we do. How do you balance the tension inevitably that you're going to get with new people coming in with other visions, other experience, against this notion that, well, this is why we do what we do, and this, we've always done it this way, and we're never going to change? How do you?
Fantastic question. So balancing long-standing cultural norms and bringing people in with different ideas about things. So I have intentionally hired people with different ideas about what we should be doing. Hiring people with different proclivities as engineers. Some people prefer immediacy, some prefer thoroughness, some prefer risk mitigation, some prefer risk avoidance. Bringing all those voices to the table, whether or not they're new or have been at the company a while, is important for creating the healthy tension that allows the team to respond to a changing world. Now, how do we balance this is the way we do things with having everyone contribute a new vision of how we should do things? So the reason why we have to say why we do the things, not just what we do, is that you have a basis for a sound argument. If we just tell you this is the way we do things, then you have no idea how to even start the conversation of challenging our assumptions. Right, so there are a couple things that engineers do that are really bad. One, they optimize systems that shouldn't even exist. And two, they accept constraints that are external to them. And so in many ways, the question that you're asking is around people accepting these constraints about how we do things. And part of the way that we talk about why we do things is how things have evolved over time. So our team has now existed for somewhere in the order of 6 or 8 years, depending how you look at it. And we've had many revolutions and changes through how we've done it. So that part of our story of why is that story of evolution of our process. And then we even try to include, and here are the things we're starting to think about for the future. As part of our annual planning process, we talk about, should the team still exist? What team needs to exist? Because we can recharter ourselves whenever we want. And what are the problems that we should be solving? And that's really when we open up the conversation to starting from first principles, kind of like a zero-based budgeting kind of approach, but to our technical strategy and approach to the problem. And then every voice is really incorporated into the room. But people who are overeager to share their view of things before they've learned the history or the why, it's kind of like misjudging where you are in that teacher or student relationship and dynamic, and that can be inappropriate and distracting to the larger team context. And so setting the context when you try and suppress that behavior a little bit, it's not that I don't care about your opinion, it's that you don't have the good information to form a solid opinion yet. That's super critical. And then setting the timeline for, in a few months, that's when we really expect you to be fully ramped up, and you're doing great as you're ramping up towards that level. To not shut it out, even if you are kind of trying to lower it in the beginning. There's another hand over here.
I think we're out of time, but
okay.
If we have time for one more question, we'll take it. No.
Oh, stop, sorry.
Okay, so,
it is lunchtime, so ciao.